James sat in his quiet, modest home, the only sound in the room the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner. His small house was nothing to speak of, just a one-story structure with peeling paint and a cracked driveway. There were no decorations on the walls, no personal touches that would make it feel like a home. It was a place to rest, to recharge after long hours spent working at the local mechanic shop. The furniture was old, mismatched, and well-worn, much like the man himself. Everything about James seemed utilitarian, stripped down to the basics: survival over comfort. He had learned long ago to keep his emotions in check. Life had taught him that vulnerability only led to hurt. Having been abandoned by his parents at a young age, and suffering a series of losses later in life, James had closed himself off from anything that might lead to deeper connections. His relationships with others were surface level at best. He had a few friends, people who respected him, but no one really knew him. They saw a mechanic who could fix anything with his hands, a man who had a reputation for being reliable and hard-working. But beneath the exterior, there was always a quiet loneliness that James never allowed anyone to see. When he wasn't working, he spent his evenings alone, sipping on a glass of whiskey and watching the same reruns on television. He didn't mind the silence; it was familiar. It kept him from having to face the parts of himself he had buried deep inside. For years, he had lived this way, isolated, emotionally distant, and just getting by. That afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, James finished a long shift at the shop and decided to take a walk around his neighborhood. He wasn't in any hurry, just moving through the motions of his day. He passed by the houses on his street, glancing into their well-kept front yards and tidy driveways. It seemed like everyone was busy with something: lawn care, cleaning out the garage, or playing with their kids. It was a quiet, sleepy town, and James often wondered if anyone else felt as hollow as he did. But it wasn't something he thought about for long. As he walked past the corner of Maple Street, he spotted three figures huddled together on the sidewalk. Two boys, maybe 10 or 11 years old, were sitting on the curb with their knees pulled up to their chests. A little girl, no older than 5 or 6, was curled up between them, clutching a small stuffed animal. They all looked out of place: dirty, ragged clothing, faces drawn with exhaustion. The boys were trying to keep the girl warm, wrapping their arms around her, but it was clear that the cold had settled into their bones. James stopped walking. The image of the three children, vulnerable and alone, sent a sharp pang through his chest. Something about them reminded him of his own childhood, how he had been abandoned, left to fend for himself, and how no one had cared to offer him the warmth and safety he so desperately needed. For a brief moment, he felt something stir within him, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: empathy. He stood there for a few seconds, unsure of what to do. He had always kept to himself, avoided situations like this, and ignored the hardships of others. He wasn't the kind of person who went around saving the day or getting involved in other people's problems. He had enough of his own burdens to carry. But these children, they didn't deserve to be out here, alone and hungry. The thought gnawed at him. One of the boys, Eli, looked up at James with tired eyes. "Excuse me, mister. Do you have any food?" The words were simple, yet they cut through James like a knife. His throat tightened, and for a second, he wanted to look away, to keep walking, to pretend he hadn't seen them. But he couldn't. The look in Eli's eyes, the vulnerability, the pleading held him in place. Without thinking, James found himself walking over to the children. His heart was pounding in his chest as he crouched down beside them. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. They're gone," Marco, the older of the two boys, mumbled, his voice thick with sorrow. "We don't have anywhere to go." The answer struck James like a punch to the gut. He could feel the weight of their situation, their isolation. They were just kids, abandoned to face the world alone, and it mirrored the painful truth of his own youth. James could see the desperation in their eyes. He knew the feeling all too well. His mind raced for a moment. He could call the authorities, get them some help. That was the right thing to do, wasn't it? But then, another voice in his head reminded him of the cold, impersonal nature of the system. These kids would be placed in foster care, bounced from one home to another, never finding the stability or love they needed. No, they needed something more, someone who wouldn't just hand them off to strangers. James hesitated. The idea of taking them in, of being responsible for them, was overwhelming. He wasn't prepared to be a father, let alone a father to 3 kids he didn't know. But then he saw Sasha, the little girl, her face buried in the sleeve of her brother's jacket as she tried to fight back tears. Her sadness was palpable, and James felt a deep, protective instinct surge within him. Without another word, he stood up and glanced around. "All right," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Come on. I'll get you something to eat, and we'll figure this out." The children looked up at him, their faces tentative, unsure if he was serious. But when Eli nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope, James realized he had already made the decision. He couldn't walk away. He couldn't leave them out here. The walk back to his house was silent. James could feel the weight of their presence beside him, the weight of the decision he had made. He had always been afraid of opening himself up to people, of letting anyone get too close. But as he led the children into his humble home, he knew this was the moment his life would change forever. He didn't have much to offer, but he would give them what he could: a warm meal, a safe place to sleep, and maybe, just maybe, a sense of belonging. For the first time in years, James felt a stirring in his heart, a feeling he thought he had long buried. It wasn't just empathy anymore, it was responsibility. And it scared him, but he couldn't turn back now. That night, as the children ate quietly at his kitchen table, James stood at the window, looking out at the darkness beyond. Something had shifted. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew that the path he had been walking for so long had just veered off in a completely new direction. And in that moment, he realized that he was no longer just a mechanic. He was something more. He was someone's protector. Someone's father. As James begins to settle into his new role as the primary caregiver for the children, life starts to feel like a constant balancing act, with new pressures at every turn. He's overwhelmed by the sense of responsibility, but the stakes keep rising, each challenge seeming more difficult than the last. One of the most immediate threats comes from social services, who initiate an investigation into the children's new living situation. Their visit is a stark reminder that everything James is fighting for could be taken away in an instant. The fear of losing the children looms large, and the scrutiny from social services makes James realize just how fragile his position is. The investigation, meant to ensure the children's welfare, feels invasive, making James hyper-aware of every small detail in their home life. He feels as though he's being watched from every angle, and that one mistake could spell disaster. His main priority becomes ensuring that the children are well cared for and that their home appears stable. He desperately needs to prove to the authorities that he's capable of providing the right environment. But the pressure doesn't stop there. At work, James's job as a mechanic is becoming increasingly demanding. Long hours, physical exhaustion, and the constant stress of trying to make ends meet weigh on him every day. The financial burden of caring for the children is starting to strain him. He's working late into the night, trying to earn as much as possible, but it doesn't feel like enough. His paycheck barely covers the costs of food, utilities, and other essentials. There's no room for error, and the stress is beginning to take its toll on his health and well-being. James finds himself constantly exhausted, running on fumes just to make sure the children are taken care of. The exhaustion starts to seep into other areas of his life. Eli, his oldest child, begins to struggle in school. His grades drop, and he withdraws from his classmates. It's clear that the change in his home life has taken a toll on him. James tries to console him, but he's unsure how to reach Eli, who seems increasingly distant. The emotional strain of the upheaval is visible on Eli's face, but James isn't sure how to fix it. He's doing everything he can just to keep things together at home, and there doesn't seem to be much left to offer in terms of emotional support. Marco, the middle child, is even more of a challenge. His emotional trauma from the past has led to frequent outbursts. James, who has little experience in dealing with such behavior, doesn't always know how to respond. There are days when Marco's anger seems to be too much for James to handle. He tries to be patient and understanding, but it's clear that Marco's trauma is deeper than James can fix on his own. Then there's Sasha, the youngest of the three. Though she's still innocent and carefree, even Sasha begins to sense the growing tension around the house. She picks up on the anxiety in the air and starts to ask questions about the future, questions that James doesn't have the answers to. Her joyful energy becomes a sharp contrast to the heavy atmosphere in the home, reminding James of the life he wants to create for them, but also of how far he's fallen from that ideal. The weight of responsibility starts to feel unbearable. Just when it seems like things can't get any more difficult, James receives a letter that threatens to undo everything he's worked so hard for. It's from a former employer, a company he worked for years ago, that is suing him for theft. The lawsuit, which he had thought was settled long ago, has come back to haunt him. The accusations are false, but the legal process is slow and expensive. If the case goes to court, it could cost James his job, his house, and potentially his freedom. The legal fight ahead is a huge risk, and James knows he can't handle it alone. The threat of losing everything he's worked for, in addition to everything he's gained with the children, suddenly feels very real. His past, something he had tried to move on from, is now threatening to drag him down. Faced with this new crisis, James is forced to make difficult decisions. He realizes that if he wants to defend himself in court, he will need legal representation, but he can't afford a lawyer on his own. He has to choose whether to take a financial risk, sacrificing what little savings he has left to hire someone who might be able to help him. The idea of paying for a lawyer when he's already struggling to provide for the children is a bitter pill to swallow, but he sees no other choice. He feels like he's stuck between two impossible decisions: risk his financial stability to protect his future, or potentially lose everything and face the consequences of a wrongful lawsuit. The internal conflict grows even more intense when he reaches out to his estranged sister, hoping she can offer some guidance or support. But when she rebuffs him, telling him he should never have taken on the responsibility of the children in the first place, James is devastated. Her words sting, especially because he had hoped that, after all this time, she would understand the gravity of his situation. Instead, she chastises him, reminding him of the mistakes of the past. She's not interested in helping him. In her eyes, he's made a mess of his life, and now he's dragging others down with him. This rejection is another blow to James's already fragile sense of self-worth. His sister's words reinforce his growing fear that he's not enough, that he's failing as a father, and that the weight of responsibility may be too much to bear. As the tension in James's life escalates, he begins to question whether he can endure it all. Can he handle the mounting pressures of caring for the children while fighting a lawsuit, holding on to his job, and trying to stay afloat financially? His body and mind are exhausted, and every day feels like a battle against time. Despite his doubts, however, James can't give up. He looks at the children, especially Sasha's innocent smile, Marco's troubled eyes, and Eli's withdrawn demeanor, and he knows that he has no choice but to keep fighting. But the road ahead is uncertain. Each new challenge feels like a test of his limits, and James wonders how much more he can take before he breaks. The stakes have never been higher. The risk of losing the children, his job, and his own sense of self-worth looms over him like a dark cloud. Yet, through it all, James's determination to make a life for his family remains his guiding force. He knows that he must find a way to weather the storm, because if he doesn't, everything he's worked for will slip through his fingers. The weight of the false accusations came crashing down on James like a ton of bricks. He had always known that life could be unpredictable, but nothing had prepared him for the full force of a legal battle he couldn't win, especially when it was based on lies. When the charges of theft resurfaced, it wasn't just his reputation that was at stake, it was his entire future. The case was moving quickly, and before he could fully process the magnitude of what was happening, the police arrived at his door. He was arrested in front of the very people he had worked so hard to protect: Eli, Marco, and Sasha. For James, it felt as if the floor had been ripped from beneath him. His heart sank as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. All of his hard work, his efforts to build a new life with the children he had come to love as his own, seemed to slip away in an instant. He had tried so hard to do the right thing, to provide stability and safety, and now everything was unraveling before his eyes. The sting of abandonment, which he had spent so many years trying to avoid, came rushing back with a vengeance. In the days that followed, James found himself alone in a sterile, cold cell, facing a future filled with uncertainty and despair. The legal system, once something he had viewed from the outside, now felt like a crushing machine, a system that didn't care about the truth or about the man he was, only about the accusations. The children, too, felt the weight of the situation. Eli, Marco, and Sasha were devastated, unsure of how to process the fact that the person they had come to trust, the one who had shown them the love and care they had missed for so long, might be taken away from them. They had already experienced abandonment once before, and now they feared it was happening again. James tried to comfort them from behind the glass, but his words felt hollow. He could see the fear in their eyes, the hurt and confusion. They wanted to believe that he would somehow make it out, but deep down, they knew the gravity of the situation. They had already lost so much in their lives, and the thought of losing James, the only person who had consistently shown them love and stability, was almost too much to bear. The fear that they might be abandoned again, that they might once again be cast adrift, gnawed at their hearts. James, however, was in no position to reassure them. He felt completely and utterly alone. For the first time since he had taken on the responsibility of caring for the children, he questioned whether he was truly capable of making things right. The legal battle felt insurmountable. The evidence against him seemed to be mounting, and the people he had once trusted, his co-workers, his friends, were either indifferent or unwilling to help. He began to spiral into a place of deep despair. The walls of the prison seemed to close in on him, and every day felt like an endless cycle of helplessness. He had no idea how to get out of this mess, and no one was coming to his rescue. The pain of being accused of something he didn't do was almost unbearable. But just when things seemed darkest, Eli, Marco, and Sasha made a decision that would change everything. They refused to accept that James was going to be lost to them. They had experienced loss too many times in their lives, but this time, they weren't going to let it happen. The bond they had with James was stronger than anything they had ever known, and they weren't going to stand by and watch him be taken away without a fight. It was Eli who first suggested they take action. Despite his young age, he had grown wise beyond his years, learning how to navigate the complexities of life that had been thrust upon him. Eli had seen how hard James had worked to make things right for them, and he wasn't about to let him be destroyed by lies. He proposed they find a lawyer who could help, someone who could navigate the legal maze and prove James' innocence. Marco, always the quiet one, immediately agreed, pulling out his phone to start researching legal contacts. Sasha, whose faith in James had never wavered, took on the task of gathering any evidence she could find that might shed light on the truth. Together, the three of them began to unravel the threads of the case. They reached out to people from James' past who could vouch for his character, colleagues from previous jobs, old friends, and even a few people from his community who had seen firsthand the kind of man he truly was. They spent countless hours poring through documents, trying to find anything that could support James' claim of innocence. It was a long, exhausting process, but they didn't give up. The children, in their own ways, began to believe in the possibility of a future without the looming threat of prison hanging over James' head. The breakthrough came when Sasha discovered an overlooked piece of evidence, an old receipt that had been misplaced during the investigation. The receipt linked the theft to another individual, someone with a clear motive to frame James. It wasn't much, but it was enough to open a door, a crack in the case that they could pry open with the help of their lawyer. The evidence, though small, proved to be the turning point. The lawyer they had contacted, who had initially been skeptical, now saw the potential to win the case. With the new evidence in hand, he filed a motion to have the case reopened. As the days passed, the children's determination to clear James' name grew stronger. They worked tirelessly with the lawyer, organizing their findings and preparing for the court battle. They had gone from being helpless, abandoned children to becoming the key players in James' defense. They had shifted the power dynamic of the situation. They had become the ones fighting for James, the ones saving him from the abyss. When the case finally went back to court, the new evidence was presented, and the tides began to turn. The opposing lawyer, who had once been so confident in his case, now found himself scrambling to respond. The defense team, armed with proof of James' innocence, was able to discredit the accusations. In a matter of hours, the case against James unraveled. The courtroom, once tense and filled with doubt, now saw the truth revealed. James was exonerated, the false charges dismissed. When he was finally released from prison, he was greeted by Eli, Marco, and Sasha, who had made it all possible. They had saved him, not just from prison, but from the despair he had almost given into. In the end, James realized that he had never truly been alone. The love and loyalty he had shown the children had come back to him tenfold. Their bond, forged through years of pain and struggle, had turned into something unbreakable. They had given him hope when he had none, and in doing so, they had proven that family was about more than just blood. It was about the people who stood by you when it mattered most. The courtroom had erupted into murmurs as the final ruling was made, and James was exonerated. The lawsuit, which had loomed over his life like a dark cloud for so long, was officially dropped. For the first time in what felt like years, he could breathe without the crushing weight of legal battles pressing down on him. The truth had won out, and the nightmare he had been living through was finally over. But the freedom that came with the verdict was bittersweet, and in the quiet moments after the celebration, James couldn't shake the emotional toll that had accumulated over the past months. Yes, he was free, but at what cost? As he stood in the courtroom, surrounded by his legal team and a few close friends, James couldn't stop thinking about the children Eli, Marco, and Sasha who had stood by him throughout the entire ordeal. They had saved him. They had stepped up in ways no children their age should have had to, sacrificing their own stability to fight for him, and now the reality of their trauma began to surface in ways he hadn't anticipated. The court case was over, but their struggles were far from finished. The fight for their safety had left its mark on them, and James knew that the emotional wounds they had sustained wouldn't heal as easily as the legal ones. The weight of what they'd been through, what they had been forced to witness and endure, couldn't just be erased with a legal victory. Eli, the oldest, had always been the responsible one, the protector. He had stepped into the role of caretaker long before he should have. Now, with the crisis behind them, Eli struggled to let go of that responsibility. He didn't know how to be a kid anymore. It was as if the years of bearing the weight of his family's survival had hardened him, and James could see the cracks in his composure. Eli's usual anger, once a way to mask his vulnerability, had only grown more intense. He acted out in ways that worried James, making it difficult to see through his tough exterior and reach the boy who was still so scared on the inside. Marco, more sensitive and quiet, retreated into himself. He had always been the one who needed reassurance, who found comfort in routines. But now, he seemed withdrawn, his bright spark of curiosity dimmed. The world he had once been so eager to explore now felt like an unfamiliar and frightening place. Marco's quietness wasn't just a result of the trauma, it was a defense mechanism, a way of coping with the emotional chaos that had swept through their lives. Then there was Sasha. Though the youngest, her struggles were no less significant. She had always been the most open, the most trusting, but the ordeal had stripped away her innocence. Sasha became fearful of even the smallest changes, her sense of safety shattered. She had started to cling to James in a way that felt suffocating at times, and he knew she was trying to make sense of a world that had taken so much from her. Her nightmares were frequent, and it broke James's heart to see her wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, unable to shake the horrors of her past. As the days passed, James found himself in a constant balancing act. He was free, but his children were not. Their emotional healing wasn't something that could be fixed overnight, and he couldn't help but feel like he had failed them in some way. Despite all his efforts to protect them, to shield them from the worst of what had happened, they were still suffering in ways he hadn't expected. James could see that their journey to healing would take time he wasn't sure he had the tools to give them. There were moments when he doubted himself, wondering if he had done enough to give them the love and care they truly needed. His mind would race with thoughts of what he could have done differently, what he should have done sooner to prevent this. He had been so focused on keeping them safe from the external world, on winning the battle against the injustice they had faced, that he hadn't always known how to help them process their trauma. He had never been good at showing vulnerability, but now, more than ever, he realized that vulnerability was what was needed to heal, not just for the children, but for him too. Despite his doubts, James knew he had to be present, more than ever. The children were starting to rebuild their lives in small, often imperceptible ways. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't linear, but James was beginning to see the small steps of progress. Eli had started to open up a little more, talking about the things that bothered him, even if only for a few minutes each day. Marco was beginning to find solace in reading again, a quiet hobby he had once enjoyed before the storm of their past had taken over. Sasha's nightmares were becoming less frequent, and though she still clung to him at night, there were moments when she would smile again, her innocence slowly starting to creep back in. James's own emotional growth was also a necessary part of their healing. For so long, he had built walls around himself, fearing that if he showed weakness, if he allowed himself to break down, he would lose everything. But in the aftermath of the trial, in the quiet moments spent with the children, he began to understand that true strength didn't come from hiding his emotions. True strength came from embracing vulnerability, from allowing himself to connect with the people he loved and trusted most. And so, he started to let his guard down. He began to show the children that it was okay to be afraid, okay to be angry, and okay to feel lost. He wasn't perfect, but he could be real with them. The emotional bond between James and the children deepened. They were no longer just survivors of a traumatic past, they were a family. And though the past would always be a part of them, they were learning to move forward together. There were setbacks. There were days when the anger, the sadness, the guilt would overwhelm them, and it felt like they were back at square one. But James knew that resilience wasn't about never falling, it was about getting back up, again and again, no matter how hard it was. The family had become stronger than it had ever been, not because they had overcome their struggles, but because they were learning how to face them, together. They were slowly rebuilding their lives, step by step. The healing was ongoing, and though they were far from perfect, they had each other. That was enough for now. And James finally allowed himself to believe that he was enough, too. The family had come a long way, but beneath the surface, the emotional scars from their troubled past still ran deep, and their journey to healing was far from complete. On the outside, things appeared to be improving. There was an outward sense of stability, a semblance of normalcy that seemed to suggest the worst was behind them. But for each member of the family, the ghosts of their past continued to haunt them, manifesting in ways that sometimes felt too difficult to bear. Their healing process was not a straight line, but a series of jagged steps, each one accompanied by its own internal battles. Eli, once the most outgoing and adventurous of the children, had begun to act out in ways that no one fully understood. The progress they had made as a family did little to quell his deep-seated fear of abandonment. Despite the love and care that James and the others had shown him, Eli was terrified that the stability he had finally come to rely on would be ripped away. His behavior grew increasingly rebellious. He refused to follow the family rules, skipped school, and spent more time with friends who had little regard for the boundaries that had been set. James couldn't help but wonder if he was making a mistake, if his efforts to create a sense of security in the home had failed Eli. The fear of losing him, of watching him drift further away, was a constant weight on his shoulders. The tension with Eli only amplified Marco's struggle. Marco, the quietest of the three children, had always kept his emotions locked inside. His withdrawn nature had always been his shield, but now it was evident that the emotional armor he had built up wasn't enough to protect him from his own mind. Marco battled with anxiety and depression, often waking up in the middle of the night from nightmares that left him shaking and drenched in sweat. The panic attacks had become more frequent, his body locking up as the fear of reliving the trauma of his past gripped him. During the day, he would retreat into himself, his face a mask of detachment, even when his family was right there, trying to reach him. His silence spoke volumes, but James wasn't sure how to break through. He had tried to reach Marco before, but it always felt like a delicate dance. Marco was too proud to ask for help, and James feared pushing too hard would cause him to pull away further. Sasha, the youngest, also felt the pressure of their collective pain, though she internalized it differently. Her protective instincts had always been strong, but now they seemed to have reached a tipping point. Despite her own vulnerabilities, Sasha had taken on the role of caretaker within the family, doing everything in her power to make sure her brothers were okay. She tried to reassure Eli when he acted out, to calm Marco when his anxiety became too overwhelming, and to be a source of light when James grew overwhelmed with guilt. In doing so, Sasha had begun to suppress her own needs, burying her own fears of being unloved or forgotten. The weight of being the family's emotional anchor was slowly suffocating her, and she didn't know how to let go of the role she had assumed. Every time she tried to express her own insecurities or sadness, it felt selfish to her. In her young mind, Sasha believed that if she could keep her family together, maybe the pain from their past would finally go away. James, who had made so much progress in healing from his own past, found himself facing new and unexpected battles as a father. Despite all the strides he had made in rebuilding his relationship with the children, the guilt still gnawed at him. He wondered if he had done enough, if he had been present enough when they needed him most, if he could have prevented the trauma that had shaped their lives before he had stepped in. He constantly questioned whether he was truly capable of being the father they deserved. In moments of solitude, James would replay the mistakes of the past over and over, thinking that maybe, just maybe, there was something more he could have done to shield them from the pain they had endured before their paths crossed. His fear of failure as a parent, the fear that he couldn't be the rock they needed him to be, hung over him like a shadow. Though the family had made substantial progress, these internal struggles, these emotional battles were impossible to escape. For all the moments of joy and togetherness they had shared, there were still long stretches of silence and uncertainty, times when the cracks in their armor seemed too wide to bridge. Mia's presence in their lives had been a stabilizing force, but even she couldn't wave a magic wand to heal all their wounds. The scars were deep, and healing required more than just time. It required confronting the things they had spent so long trying to ignore. For Eli, his fears were rooted in a past of instability, where the people he had once trusted had abandoned him without warning. He had never learned how to cope with the idea that people could leave, and his wild behavior was a manifestation of that fear. His inner turmoil, though hard to understand from the outside, was a cry for reassurance, for the kind of security he had never been given. James tried to offer him that security, but Eli's broken trust was not easily mended. Marco's struggle, on the other hand, was tied to the emotional wounds that had been left untreated for too long. His silence was not an indication of apathy, but of a young boy overwhelmed by the weight of his emotions. Anxiety and depression didn't have an obvious face, and Marco's battle was largely invisible to those around him. It was only in the quiet moments, when his thoughts ran wild, that he truly felt the extent of his fear. James watched him closely, and though he had made efforts to offer help, he found himself at a loss for how to reach Marco. The more he pushed, the more Marco retreated. Sasha, on the other hand, struggled with the burden of being the family's emotional caretaker. The youngest of the three, she had always felt a need to protect her brothers, but as the family's challenges continued to mount, Sasha began to feel the cracks in her own armor. She longed for comfort, for someone to lean on, but she was too afraid to admit that she was overwhelmed. She didn't know how to ask for help, didn't know how to stop taking care of everyone else when she needed someone to take care of her. Through all these struggles, James came to an important realization. Healing didn't mean having all the answers. It didn't mean being perfect. It meant embracing the imperfection, the vulnerability, and the moments of failure that came with being a family. He began to understand that his fear of being a failure as a father didn't have to define him. He could be honest with his children about his own struggles, about the times he felt lost and uncertain. In doing so, he showed them that it was okay to be weak, to admit when you were hurting, and that growth came from facing those fears head-on. In sharing his own vulnerabilities, James gave the children permission to do the same. The family's journey to healing would not be easy, and it would not be quick. But for the first time, there was a sense that they could face their inner demons together step by painful step. Each of them, in their own way, had to confront their pasts and the wounds they had carried for so long. Only then could they truly begin to heal and embrace the possibility of a future that, despite all the pain, was still worth fighting for. James stood in the middle of the modest living room, looking around at his children, each one with their own unique spark of determination in their eyes. Eli, the oldest, sat on the edge of the couch, arms crossed but with a focused gaze that told James everything he needed to know about his son's willingness to step up. Marco, always the creative one, was at the kitchen table, scribbling something down on a notepad, his mind already brimming with ideas for their future. Sasha, the youngest, stood by the window, her face full of quiet hope as she gazed out at the world beyond, dreaming of possibilities. This was at the moment where they would decide what kind of future they wanted to build, not just as individuals, but as a family. The past few months had been a whirlwind. The legal battle had taken everything out of them, physically, emotionally, and financially. But in the end, they'd emerged victorious. That legal victory, which had seemed so elusive at one point, had given them a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them a chance to finally break free from the shadows of their past and start over. James knew this wasn't the time to sit idly by and wait for things to improve. They had to act now. He had been thinking long and hard about his next step. The old life, the one they had lived before the trial, was no longer an option. He couldn't go back to the dead-end jobs, the constant struggle, the feeling of being stuck in a system that had little hope for someone like him. No, he had always dreamed of running his own business, of working for himself and building something that his children could be proud of. But that dream had always felt out of reach until now. "All right, listen up," James began, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of the decision he was about to make. "I'm going to open the shop. I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I know it's risky. But I can't keep going around in circles. I want to give us a chance, a real chance to build something we can call our own." The room fell silent as his children absorbed his words. It was a bold move, one that carried a lot of weight. A new auto shop in their neighborhood wasn't just a business venture, it was a shot at a fresh start, a shot at breaking free from the cycle of struggle they had been trapped in for years. It wasn't going to be easy, and they all knew it. But it was a chance, and that was more than they'd had in a long time. Eli was the first to speak. He leaned forward, his arms still crossed but his face showing a mixture of caution and optimism. "You really think it's going to work? I mean, it's not like the neighborhood's got a ton of people looking for auto repairs. We're going to need more than just a dream to pull this off." James nodded. He had expected this kind of response. Eli was practical, street smart, and didn't shy away from the tough questions. "I know it's not going to be easy. But I've got enough saved from the legal victory to get started. I don't want to waste this opportunity. We've been scraping by for too long. It's time we make something of ourselves." Sasha, who had been quiet until now, turned around from the window. Her face was radiant, full of youthful optimism, her voice soft but sure. "I think we can do it. If we all work together, we can make it happen. We've been through worse, right? What's a little risk compared to everything we've already overcome? Marco, who had been scribbling ideas on a notepad, finally looked up, his eyes lighting up with excitement. We can make it something special, he said, his words rushing out as if he had been waiting for this moment. It can't just be another auto shop. It has to be something people talk about, something that stands out. Maybe we could make it a community hub, offer more than just repairs. People need a place to come together. We could host car shows, have family events, stuff like that. The energy in the room shifted, as Marco's words planted a seed of possibility in everyone's minds. They weren't just talking about a business, they were talking about a vision. A vision that went beyond just fixing cars. They were talking about creating a space that could bring their community together, a place that could become a symbol of hope and perseverance. And suddenly, the risk didn't seem as daunting. It felt like a challenge they could take on, together. James smiled, proud of the way his children were embracing the idea. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Eli, I know you've got connections in the neighborhood. You know who needs repairs and who can't afford them. We can use that to our advantage. Eli nodded thoughtfully. I know the people who've been let down by the system, who can't afford the high prices. We can do something for them, make sure they know that we're here to help. Marco added, and I'll start working on the design of the shop. We need to make it look professional but welcoming. We want people to feel like they're walking into a place that's more than just a business. It needs to have character, like it's part of the community. Sasha, who had been the quietest of the three, now spoke up again, her voice steady but full of heart. And we'll be there every step of the way. We've got each other. We've always had each other. James looked at his children, a sense of pride welling up inside him. They were no longer the kids who had to rely on him for everything. They were partners in this venture, each of them contributing something unique, something essential. They had come a long way from the days when they were barely scraping by, when every decision seemed like a gamble. Now, they had a plan. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was a plan that they all believed in, a plan they were willing to work for. With the foundation of their new future laid out in front of them, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was still risky. The neighborhood wasn't exactly a hotbed for business success, and the financial pressure would be enormous. But with his children by his side, he knew they could make it work. They weren't just building a business, they were building a new life, one that was grounded in hard work, family, and the belief that they could overcome anything, together. As they sat around the table, putting the finishing touches on their plan, James knew that this was the beginning of something special. It wasn't just about opening an auto shop, it was about redefining their future, creating a legacy that they could be proud of. No matter what came next, they were ready. Together, they were unstoppable. The day that would determine James' fate had finally arrived. His shop, the cornerstone of his dreams and the heart of his family's future, was on the verge of collapse. After months of hard work, dealing with financial strain, and overcoming personal struggles, it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. Yet, it wasn't just the usual setbacks that threatened his business now, it was something far more sinister. A rival mechanic, Thomas Caldwell, had long viewed James' shop as a competitor, but recently, Caldwell had escalated his tactics. He had resorted to sabotage, discreetly damaging James' inventory and spreading rumors to discredit the shop. For James, who had poured every ounce of his energy into building the business from the ground up, the betrayal hit hard. The sabotage had left him with dwindling resources and only a thin thread of hope keeping the shop afloat. But that morning, as he sat in his office, staring at the bills and repair orders that piled up like a mountain, James knew he had to make a decision. He could no longer keep running from the looming crisis, he had to confront it head on. He had no choice but to fight back, not just for the shop, but for his family, his kids, who had grown up around this business, and who had been his partners in this journey, supporting him even when he had doubted himself. James knew it wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs, too. The kids, Mia, Ben, and Sarah, had all grown in ways that reflected the struggles they had endured together. Mia had become a skilled mechanic in her own right, proving time and time again that she had the technical expertise to back up her natural talent. Ben, though younger, had taken on the role of a sharp strategist, using his knack for problem solving to help keep the business running in lean times. Sarah, the youngest, had inherited her father's work ethic and his uncanny ability to calm people in moments of chaos. They had all become pillars of the shop, just as much as James had. James called them all into the office that morning. His voice was low, his mind heavy with the weight of the decision ahead. "Listen, we've been through a lot," he started, looking each of them in the eyes. "I don't want to lose this place. I know it's been tough, and I know it feels like we're fighting an uphill battle, but I'm not ready to give up. This shop isn't just a business, it's our legacy. And I think it's time we stand together and fight for it." The room fell silent for a moment, each of the kids processing the gravity of their father's words. They had known the struggles, had seen the sleepless nights, and the countless hours James had put in to make sure they had food on the table. But now, they could see the determination in his eyes. This was more than just another obstacle, it was the fight of their lives. "Dad," Mia spoke first, her voice steady. "We're with you. Whatever happens, we stick together." Ben nodded, his usual quiet confidence radiating through him. "If this guy wants to play dirty, then we'll play smarter. We've got a plan, right?" Sarah, still a little shy but with an edge of determination in her tone, added, "We've been through worse. We can handle this." And just like that, the decision was made. The family would confront Thomas Caldwell, face the sabotage, and do whatever it took to protect their future. It wasn't just about business anymore, it was about family, trust, and the love they had for the work they did together. The strength they had built, not just as individuals but as a unit, was their greatest weapon. The next day, they showed up at Caldwell's shop. It was a run-down place, almost as if it was designed to be intimidating, but James stood firm. This wasn't just about physical strength, it was about standing up to the intimidation, using their skills to show that they wouldn't be pushed around any longer. Caldwell, as smug as ever, watched as James and his kids entered his shop. He seemed amused by the sight of the family standing together. "What's this? The family's come to play hero," he taunted, leaning back in his chair. "You really think you can take me down? You've been struggling for months." James stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "We've been struggling, but we haven't lost. You're the one who's been playing dirty. And now, it's time for that to end." Mia stepped up next, holding a wrench in her hand, as though she was ready for anything. "We're not afraid of you, Caldwell. We've built this shop from the ground up, and we're not going anywhere." Ben walked up to the counter, his mind already working, formulating a plan in his head. "You've made some serious mistakes, Caldwell. And we're going to make sure you pay for them. Not just for what you did to the shop, but for all the people you've hurt to get here. It was a standoff. Caldwell had underestimated the family and their resolve. He tried to intimidate them, talking down to them, threatening them with legal action and his vast network of contacts. But what he didn't understand was that James and his kids had something far more valuable than money or connections. They had unity. Then, the turning point came. Sarah, who had been quiet up until then, stepped forward and offered a simple but powerful challenge. We don't need to play your game. We just need to show that we're better, that we do things the right way. And with that, the family got to work. They used every skill they had developed over the years: Mia's mechanics expertise, Ben's resourcefulness, Sarah's calm under pressure, and James' leadership to turn the tables on Caldwell. They exposed his sabotage for what it was, presenting evidence that was undeniable, and they got the authorities involved. Caldwell's empire began to crumble as quickly as it had risen. His dirty tactics caught up with him, and the authorities were soon investigating his business practices. Meanwhile, James' shop, which had once been on the brink of failure, was now on the verge of a new chapter. The community rallied around them, supporting the shop with newfound loyalty and respect. The emotional high point came when James, his kids by his side, stood outside the shop late one evening. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow on the small business they had fought to protect. James looked at his children, pride swelling in his chest. "We did it," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Together." And in that moment, they all knew the truth. No matter what came next, they had proven that the strength of family, unity, and integrity was